wisdom and your guidance from the Holy Spirit, that we will say the words you'd have us speak. We pray for those who come tonight. I pray that you'll bless them with wisdom as well. That you'll give us courage and faithfulness to be your witnesses here tonight. I pray that as we go out, and the people who come as they go out, that they too will be equipped to be your witnesses in this world. That you will be glorified in their name. Give you thanks for each person who is here tonight. Give blessing all this in Jesus' name.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Really appreciate that you're here. We're glad you're here. It's going to be a great time together. My name is Dan Baldwin. I'm a student here at Fuller Seminary, and I'm a part of the Able Theology group here. And we're going to give a presentation tonight on disabilities here at Fuller and our experiences, and also some of our reflections on that. To begin with, we're going to show a video from Dr. David Downs, who is currently in Tanzania. He is a faculty advisor for Able Theology here at Fuller Seminary. And so we're going to start with that, and then we'll go from there.
Good evening. My name is David Downs, and I am Associate Professor of New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary. I'm also the faculty advisor to the Able Theology student group, and I was asked to say a few words about how I see tonight's topic being important for Fuller. Let me begin by apologizing for not being able to be present at tonight's conversation. I'm on leave during the spring quarter, and my family and I are living in Mwanza, Tanzania, where we spend about 5 to 6 months a year, since my wife is a medical doctor who does clinical medical research in the Lake Victoria region. And I'm sitting in my office, which also doubles as a spare bedroom. You can see the mosquito net behind me. If I were to turn the camera around, you'd get a glimpse of the southern shore of Lake Victoria here in the city of Mwanza, where we live. So I'm sorry that I can't be here tonight, but I hope you'll understand. Let me begin by saying personally, I care a lot about theological education and disability, in large part because a member of my immediate family has often been ostracized by the church because of a disability. I'm also married to a doctor, as I mentioned, so I'm interested in the integration of biblical studies and healthcare. Although if you know anything about the discipline of disability studies, you will know that there is often an uneasy tension between medical perspectives on disability and the so-called social model of disability. I would argue that a very important part of Fuller's mission should be to help Christian leaders to think theologically about disability, and more importantly, to put that thinking into practice as they establish, lead, and support Christian communities and organizations that welcome the gifts of all the saints. This is not part of our institutional DNA at Fuller Seminary, however. In Fuller's famous Mission Beyond a Mission document from 1983, for example, there is a long section on the moral issues raised by medical technology, and there is language about, quote, advocacy of the handicapped, the weak, and the disadvantaged, language that in 2014 can easily be read as condescending. But there is no careful reflection on how ministry with, among, or for the disabled might be part of Fuller's Mission Beyond a Mission. As an institution, my sense is that Fuller, at all of its campuses, has a long way to go in order to become the kind of welcoming community that allows students with disabilities of various kinds to thrive in their pursuits of God's calling, and importantly, that encourages all students, especially those who do not consider themselves to be disabled, to recognize that developing a theology of disability is not something that just a select group of students do, but instead, thinking about and wrestling with disability in light of Scripture is something that every Christian leader ought to do. We at Fuller need to do a much better job of integrating disability into our theological curriculum. In 2008, the Association of Theological Schools adopted a policy on disability and theological education. It is not a requirement for accreditation, but it consists of some recommendations that challenge schools in the Association of Theological Schools to do a better job of integrating disability concerns in their curriculum. Let me quote from that document, which begins by saying, that they challenge schools, quote, to live toward a vision of inclusion of all God's people in theological education. This policy statement further calls upon each ATS member school to welcome people with disabilities into the communal life and mission of the institution. It also invites schools to become models for their religious constituents regarding ministry to and with persons who have disabilities. Indeed, it is a theological call for each school to work toward the fullest possible inclusion of all God's people in its work and witness. Disability is both an individual and community issue. Schools should become inclusive communities where all qualified people can learn and serve. The policy concludes with a footnote suggesting a few ways in which the goals of the policy might be implemented. And I would encourage you to check this policy out. You can find it if you Google ATS and disability policy. The footnote says, quote, a multifaceted approach toward inclusion could include activities such as encouraging faculty and students to include disability topics in their research, chapel services led by people with disabilities, special courses or symposia dealing with theology, disability, and religious life, teaching how people with disabilities can also minister to others rather than simply being the objects of care, or continuing education about disability for community clergy. It seems to me that this event this evening, sponsored by and organized by Able Theology, is precisely the kind of action needed to help Fuller become a more inclusive and effective learning community. I regret that I cannot participate in this evening's conversation, but I wish that you all have the best in your discussions, and I hope that your conversations are fruitful in many ways. Thank you.
Tonight we also have with us Dr. Juan Martinez. He is the Vice Provost and the Chair of the Diversity Council here at Fuller, and we've invited him here tonight to say a few words about this event as well.
Good evening. It's good to be with you folks, and thank you for the invitation. As Vice Provost, these are issues that are important to the work that I do, and I ran into Able Theology when I saw the group being organized. I went to the first meeting because I attended church where we have a number of people who we want to treat well, but we're not always sure how to make them part of the community, how to be sure that we're being church, and that we're being the people of God effectively. So I decided to go and ended up being somewhat connected. I'm grateful for that. Thank you for letting me in and letting me be a part of what you're doing. The connections God has placed in my life, either family who's had issues of access, of disability. When I was in high school, the last century, so it's been a while, I was invited to help a young woman from my high school class who was blind. And back before we had other technologies, I actually read the book to her, read the textbook to her, and used what we used to call cassette tapes. You may have heard of those things if you've seen them in museums, to actually get the materials available to her. So I've had connections at different points. As my role as Vice Provost and the commitment of Fuller Seminary, you heard David Downs talk more about the kinds of things that we need to be committed to, so I won't repeat those types of things. But part of the challenge that I have seen, both as a professor, how do we create a situation where we really are serving the people of God and preparing the people of God to serve the people of God? And how are we doing that effectively? So everything from learning styles, from trying to develop the classroom experience so that everyone can be a part, depending on our differences. Access, one of the things that I, as a person who's been involved in many building projects, your vision defines your buildings, and then your buildings define you and define your vision. And just the very simple thing of getting people up here to the front of this auditorium this evening, and wonderful challenges of having to open back doors, not front doors, to get people here. Those are the kinds of things that I, as part of the senior administration, have to address, and the fact that we have defined spaces, not always the spaces that then feel very welcoming. And so those are part of our challenges, because we know everything costs money, but where does our money go? And those are parts of the kinds of challenges. I just want to reflect for a minute or two. An article that I recommend to you if you've never read it. Elizabeth Conde Fraser, a good friend of mine, professor, now the dean of Esperanza College in Philadelphia, wrote an article called From Hospitality to Shalom. And the purpose of this article is to talk about how do we together get to shalom. And one of the things that she talks about a process. Many of us, when we encounter difference or difficulty or challenge in others, we think that hospitality is a good thing. I agree, hospitality is a good thing. Fuller's not always very hospitable. And some of you could name some of those lacks. But if we're serious about being hospitable, then we will have to encounter each other, which means I have to learn from you and not just serve you or show how wonderful I am in helping you. And as we encounter each other, sometimes that creates pain. And in my role, I sometimes get to address some of those pains where people are saying, hey, wait a minute. All of a sudden you discovered us. We were here all along. And all of a sudden, we say in Spanish, you discovered tap water. It was always there. I just didn't have eyes to see. And part of what I hope happens tonight is, first of all, getting beyond hospitality to encounter, to actually hear our stories, our experiences of how it is that God is working in our lives together to be the people of God, to be the servants of God, to be the servants of the people of God, and how we do that well. He says that if we struggle through encounter, one of the things is we usually don't want to encounter because encounter is painful. Because encounter puts up a mirror. Encounter forces me to face the kinds of things I really would rather not face. I mean, I'd like for us to sing, all of us sing Kumbaya. The fact that you can't get to the where the fire is at so we can sing together, that's a secondary problem. But in encounter, then we have to say, wait a minute. How have we created or not created spaces for us to be the people of God together? As we learn to hear each other, sometimes painfully, sometimes not wanting to hear each other, we can build compassion. Now, the problem with compassion is that it's me being the wonderful person, helping you. Now, I need to have compassion. I need to see the challenges. I need to face the fact that I have created, or I am part of a system that has created unhelpful situations. But I need to get past that, I'm this wonderful person of God who's here to help you, to a passion of saying, how do we work at this together? And how do I learn from you? How am I challenged? How do I grow in this process? And Elizabeth says, after passion, then we can start talking about shalom. Shalom, that space where the blessing of the Lord, together, we are walking toward God's future and serving each other as the people of God. So, my prayer for Able Theology, for this activity and those that come afterwards, is that we will create, first, systems of hospitality, but opportunities for encounter, to be challenged, to grow, to learn from each other, which hopefully will push us to compassion. Compassion also from those that we see as the objects of compassion. You need to have compassion for us too. Because some of us only know how to make you an object. We don't know how to have you be a subject. And we have to learn that. And that's going to be hard for some of us. We are very good. Tell me how to help you. Don't tell me how you're going to help me. Because I don't need your help, I think. I tend to believe. And then we approximate the vision of shalom, where we are the people of God together in anticipation of God's future, in anticipation of the place where God wants us. So this is my prayer, my hope for tonight, and for Able Theology and for Fuller Theological Seminary. So thank you for the opportunity of being a part. I get the privilege of now presenting Dr. Bethany McKinney.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. So this is kind of the final part of the introductory piece before you kind of get some stories. So we felt like it's important that in having a conversation about disability, it's really important that we speak rightly about people with disabilities, and then we also kind of clarify some of the terms and the framework that we're using. So you'll notice that most of us here on the panel, we will use phrases like people with disabilities instead of phrases like disabled people or the disabled. And this is called people first language. And it's a way to acknowledge that all of us with or without disabilities are people first, made in the image of God before any other characteristics that might be identifiable of us. So that a person's identity is not primarily in their disability, though that's an aspect of their identity, but that they are a person with dignity, created in the image of God, with an assortment of identifying characteristics and gifts and limitations and all of that. So that's just a note on how we talk about people with disabilities. And there are actually several ways of thinking about disability and what is disability and what is the problem and what is the solution and all those kinds of things. And those are kind of called various models for framing disability. But I think we don't always realize that there are different ways of approaching disability because our culture actually has a dominant way of thinking about disability that's pretty hegemonic in that it's just kind of in the air we breathe, that we don't necessarily even consider that we are looking through a particular view because it's just so kind of unquestioning and unknowingly just everybody has it. But as followers of Jesus, our goal is to look at these issues and approach them with the love and the wisdom and grace that we see from Jesus. And so sometimes we might not even realize that these starting definitions of disability we have already affected how we think theologically, how we're reading the biblical texts and perceiving Jesus' actions and everything else. But we want to be faithful. And so this conversation today, it's really important that we know it's not just about being nice or being inclusive or accommodating just to be good people, but that it's actually about being faithful followers of Jesus. And so that's why we kind of need to be clear about where our definitions are coming from and how we're thinking about things. So first we'll look at the dominant way of thinking about disability in our culture, which is called the medical model of disability. And in the medical model of disability, the location of the problem is in the body of the individual with the disability. So if someone is blind, then the problem is that their eyes, don't see. The location of the problem is in their eyes. And so in the medical model, the method of solution is medical treatment, genetic research, to find a cure, eliminating disabilities altogether. So it's focused in the individual body. So in the case of blindness, it would be, doing some kinds of surgeries and other things to kind of correct the problem, which is in the body. And so this model, the medical model, is individualistic. It's focused on the limitations of the person with the disability, both in the problem and in the solution. And now another model of disability, kind of by way of contrast, there are actually several models of disability, but we're just going to have time to look at one today just to kind of show that there's another approach. And this one is pretty popular in the disability community, and that's called the social model of disability. And in the social model, the location of the problem is in the way that the physical or social environment is structured. So the system of social relations and institutions that has marginalized people with disabilities as a group. So it's not necessarily the person's body and what it can and cannot do that is the location of the problem. It's that we've kind of constructed the world in such a way, both in our built environment and in kind of our own expectations of people and how we interact and all those kinds of things are constructed in such a way that people need to access them, or some people can access it easier than others, and some people can't access it at all. So in that case, if the problem is not necessarily in the body but in the constructed environment, then the method of solution would be a shift in social attitudes, so kind of more positive attitudes about certain traits and behaviors, not underestimating the quality of life for people with different limitations and impairments, obviously the accessibility of the physical environment, but also social support, civil rights, legal protection, those kinds of things, and just the way that we interact in the environment. So it's like the solution is not necessarily in the body itself, but it's kind of in the social world. And so this model is focused on the role of society and culture in creating disabling conditions for people with various limitations. So it's kind of like a person may have an impairment or disability, but they're not necessarily disabled by that, depending on how the world is constructed around them. And so our starting point for understanding disability, like whether we look through, you can see these models are hugely different from each other in terms of how you're going to approach disability, how you think about it, how you think about what needs to be done in the world, where money needs to go towards research, towards changing environments. There's so many questions that are influenced by these perspectives. And so, depending on where you begin, in one of, if you're really rooted in one of these or the other, it will change what you notice in biblical texts, for example. And then once those things get changed, it influences kinds of practices that you put into place here at Fuller, in our churches, and just in the world. Our starting point is going to lead to all those different things. So just as an example, I'm going to look at one healing text in the Gospels, and then just briefly show how what people kind of coming from a medical model perspective might notice in the text, and then what people coming from a social model perspective might notice. So this is in Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. So they came to Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. So in this text, you can see that if someone was coming from a very strong kind of medical model, whether kind of knowingly or unknowingly, what you're going to notice in this text in terms of what constitutes healing, what happened, is that this man comes up to Jesus. He can't see. He's called a blind man several times in the text. He asks to regain his sight, and at the end of the text it says he regained his sight. And so, very clearly the problem was this guy couldn't see, and the solution was Jesus restored his sight. End of story, beautiful healing, that's it. But if you're coming from a social model perspective, you'll notice several other things, like that he was initially a beggar. You'll notice that the people are kind of yelling at him and telling him to be quiet. He's being silenced at the beginning. And that part of what Jesus does is tell those people that are silencing him to go get him and bring them to him. So in a way, Jesus is actually changing kind of the social environment as much as he's also restoring this man's sight. He's doing a lot of other things too. And if we're kind of fixated only on the bodily transformation that takes place, we can miss some of the things that are happening on other levels. Like at the very end, it says, he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. So he becomes a follower of Jesus too. It's really not just about this bodily healing. But if we kind of are confined to one way of thinking about things and aren't aware that kind of what disables someone is so much bigger than just what's in their body, and there's so many things Jesus was addressing instead of just people's bodies in the actual text. Like, we're not just making this up based on ADA regulations or something. This is like in our text. So it's like once you kind of realize that your starting point is showing you different things in the text, then it's a way of kind of moving forward more holistically. So now we have a wonderful opportunity moving forward after this introductory time of hearing some stories from students. And first, we'll be hearing from Esther Lee, who is an MDiv student here at Fuller and the president of Able Theology and a good friend. So.
I regret to say that my experiences at Fuller have not been per se positive. When I first visited Fuller before enrolling, the former head of the Access Services Office informed me that most students with disabilities drop out. I understood this to mean that most Fuller students with disabilities are not equipped to handle Fuller's academic rigor, and that this presumption applied to me. As a law school graduate, I was offended, not only for myself, but for other students with disabilities. Fuller is a graduate school with students who have at least undergraduate degrees and know how to succeed academically. However, I must say that after nearly 2 years at Fuller, that Fuller is more stressful than law school because of the expedited quarter system, which is compounded by constantly having to advocate for myself with my disability. In many ways, Fuller reminds me of working for the White House. Whenever I have access for accommodation issues, these issues often enter a black hole that is above my non-existent pay grade, and invisible authorities determine the one option they can offer me. Carmen Valdez, the Student Services Director, has been great advocating for me and helping me navigate the black hole and invisible authorities. Before Fuller, I did not attend private schools because of their reputation for being unaccommodating and inaccessible. I thought Fuller would be okay because it has an access services office, unlike all of the other seminaries I considered. As I prepared to attend Fuller, I thought, how bad could it be if Fuller provides accessible housing, exam accommodations, note takers, and converted my books? For the most part, my books have been converted in a timely manner. My biggest challenge at Fuller has been housing, a constant struggle for me because I need wheelchair accessible housing. Although I applied to and started communicating with Fuller Housing a year before I started, I thought that I would not receive housing in time to start school. I communicated my general access needs to Fuller Housing staff, but I did not hear from them until a month or so before my move-in date. They said that they were making a unit accessible and that I needed to sign the lease before seeing it modified. Because they did not communicate exactly how they were modifying the unit, I moved in to find that it did not meet my needs. Unlike my law school housing and private apartments that worked with me to meet my needs once I moved in, Fuller did not, and my unit still does not meet my needs. Fuller Housing does not want to make any more modifications since it already spent a significant amount of money on modifications that it failed to communicate with me about. If they talked with me before making these modifications, they would have realized that it was not appropriate for me and saved money in the process. I spoke with a Fuller faculty member at orientation who said that ministry will be difficult with my speech impediment. While I am used to hearing these statements in other contexts, this caught me off guard because I wasn't even asking about whether I could do ministry. I was asking if she knew of any nonprofits doing disability work. I was also surprised that this was coming from a female faculty member, since a similar statement could be said about women in ministry. I discussed this situation with another faculty member I met during my orientation. She apologized for the other faculty member's response that there is a problem, rather than how my particular story and gifts might serve the body of Christ. Some of my subsequent professors have said similar things, welcoming me and my unique perspectives. I am glad to report that my professors have been accommodating and easy to work with. I am surprised, though, that at a community that embraces gender-inclusive language, Fuller hasn't explored inclusive language for people with disabilities. A few students have asked me about appropriate language, and I hope that our flyers for this event created a starting point for Fuller to think about using inclusive language when discussing disabilities. One caveat to this is that language is always changing, and what's appropriate today may be replaced with other language tomorrow. Bethany informed me that the person-first language that I thought was generally accepted is in controversy within the disability community. I have always received extended time on exams because I use one finger to type, and this takes me longer. During the first exam I took at Fuller, the proctor from the Access Services office told me during the exam that my taking more time on my exam gave me an unfair advantage over other students without extended time. This was disheartening and nerve-wracking to hear, especially because I was well within my allotted time, but also because it was coming from a representative of the Access office that is supposed to support students with disabilities. It made me wonder if the whole Fuller community felt that way. Last quarter, I took a class online and my TA was confused whether to grade my exams because I received extended time. I'm not sure if he just never had a student who received extended exam time, or if he similarly thought I had an unfair advantage. I wonder if I should be concerned that he might grade me down because of this. I have never encountered situations like this before regarding receiving extended time, which I have been receiving since elementary school. Although the other Fuller students received 10 free counseling sessions, when I tried to set up counseling, I was informed that the students providing the free counseling cannot provide counseling to me because I would need to bring my assistant with me to interpret my speech, and that would take longer. I was surprised because I thought that the School of Psychology would want to prepare its students to work with diverse clients, including those with disabilities and speech impediments. I have struggled during my time at Fuller with my calling and how to use my Fuller education and experiences to complement that. Although I don't know exactly what my calling is, I never felt called to work in a church. I am an attorney, starting a nonprofit housing cooperative for people with and without disabilities. It might be the fact that I'm in the MDiv program, but I have had difficulty trying to make my seminary education applicable to a world of non-believers and to my nonprofit. I thought perhaps Hospital Shuplanchi would be a good fit for me since I might be able to relate to patients in the hospital who have acquired disabilities. Attending a panel at Fuller and talking with a few hospital chaplains who thought it would not be possible for me to find a hospital that would let me bring my assistants who alternate shifts made me think that Shuplanchi is not a possibility for me. However, I met Dr. Ireland this quarter and she has been trying to help me investigate Shuplanchi further since she is a military chaplain. I have had primarily positive experiences with the Fuller librarians, except for the time a librarian gave my assistant a hard time about renewing a library book for me without my being present. Jeff Waldrop and his staff have been very accommodating, pulling books I ask for. I've learned the key to success is making friends with librarians everywhere, even at the White House. I've had difficulty finding note takers. For example, in my early church history class that had exams, out of the 3 note takers, I only had 1 by the end of the quarter. In other classes, I struggled to even find 1 note taker. I do think that the stressful quarter for all students has an impact on being able to get notes. Before Fuller, I never had difficulty finding a peer note taker, even in middle school. I wonder if my negative experiences with accessibility issues and insensitivity in church settings reflect my experiences at Fuller. I cannot see the words on the bottom of the screen when everybody is standing up for worship since I am sitting in my wheelchair. One church thought it solved the problem by having a separate section in the back, which I find very problematic for people with disabilities that has individualized TV screens. This takes away from my ability to take part in the community because I am not watching the community screen with the rest of the church. I also find how I am talked to at church is problematic. I was talking with the pastor after service and my assistant was getting frustrated that the pastor talked to her as an intermediary instead of directly to me. I explained to this assistant that the standard for disability awareness and sensitivity in churches is extremely low. This low standard seems transferable to seminaries. I am accustomed to not fitting in or belonging in the communities I belong to. A lot of my friends with disabilities are hostile toward God and joke around about my culture and Christianity, while Korean Americans are not sensitive to disability matters. Although I am used to not belonging, I feel that out of all of my experiences, I have not belonged the most at Fuller. I think it makes sense that there is a high dropout rate for students with disabilities here, considering how Fuller has not been well equipped in fostering an inclusive environment. There is always room for improvement, even at the best university for students with disabilities. I should know. I went there for undergrad. If Fuller embraces this and really works with its students with disabilities, I think that it will improve its inclusivity for students with disabilities.
Now I have the pleasure of introducing Justin. Who will share with his experiences about being a student at Fuller.
By the looks of things, you might not think I actually have a disability. And sorry, my disability is ADHD, so I need to stick to what I've already written. So I'll stick with that. Thank you all for coming to this important event. I'm getting ahead of myself. You have many options for where you could be right now, and you decided to listen to students with disabilities share their journey at Fuller Seminary. You've also decided to engage with the question of how to make Fuller a more welcoming and inclusive place for students with disabilities. Thank you for your time. For me, this evening marks a milestone in my own spiritual formation and psychological development. Outside of occasional but increasingly frequent Facebook posts, this is my most public discussion of a deeply personal and important part of my life. Living with a cognitive condition known as attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD. There's not enough time for me to go into all the details surrounding the history of ADHD and, or as you may know, ADD and the language changes and the changes in how it has been understood in the medical community and wider society. However, sorry, I got these out of order. Start my life. Second page. Great. Okay. I was trying to be well organized and such, so I'm trying to do that, such is life. However, there are some important things you should know. Please keep in mind I am not a neuropsychologist, but thankfully I'm married to one. Oh, and she's videotaping me. Oh, that's nice. Thanks, baby. I'm speaking from what I've come to know and how I've experienced the effects of ADHD. First, ADHD is from the medical model, even I use medical model terminology to make it so it can make sense. That's interesting. So ADHD is a neurological condition from a medical model standpoint that primarily affects the frontal lobe of the brain. This is where all of our executive functioning happens. Basically, it's a place that deals with decision making, sequencing, and problem solving. It helps us keep track of our daily plans and organizes information we receive so we can understand it. Here's a quick day in the life for me living with executive functioning difficulties associated with ADHD. One day back in college, I left my apartment and went back 9 different times. Each time I returned to find something I forgot to take with me. Left my apartment, got to my car and started to drive off when I said, dang it, I left my homework back in my apartment. Went back, searched around for it, found the receipt I was looking for the day before, stumbled upon a book on cross-cultural ministry that gave me a new idea for an outreach to do at church, which led me to skim reading the book, writing down my ideas, putting the book down, and then asking myself, what did I come up here to look for again? I left to return to my car, not knowing what I was looking for, only to remember when I got back in the car. So I go back, find it, and finally leave my apartment 30 minutes later than I had planned. By the time I get to school, I've missed half the lecture. I then had to take extra time to copy my friend's notes. I feel like a disappointment to my professor, who now knows me as the guy who is late all the time. I also feel frustrated and wonder why this always happens to me, even when I'm motivated to be someplace on time or need to meet people I love. At this point, maybe thinking, that sounds like an easy fix. You can get a planner, think through your day, and be more disciplined with your time, or the one I love the most, focus. And be disciplined with your time. This isn't a cognitive disorder, this is a time management problem. My answer to that is yes, but it's more complex than that. It's also easier to say that if you naturally have stronger executive functioning than I have. If you want to discuss the issues surrounding the diagnosis of ADHD or other issues, please talk to me after the event or find me on Facebook. I'd love to talk more about it. Speaking of this, it's important for you to know that I'm not making my diagnosis up. Yes, some people are misdiagnosed with ADHD, but I'm not. I've taken half a dozen neurological exams where I scored in the 10th to 15th percentile in executive functioning capabilities, compared to the average person. I've also had neuropsychological reports written explaining this diagnosis and symptoms associated with ADHD. I assure you, I have also done my homework and worked very hard to overcome my challenges. I've learned ways to cope with my condition, but it's still a daily struggle I live with. It might not be as visible as a physical disability, but I assure you my cognitive difficulties are very real and contribute to significant challenges functioning in certain institutions, such as a graduate school like Fuller Seminary. In case you're wondering, I did not forget there's a presentation about my academic struggles at Fuller. I'm also where I only have, anyone know how much time I got left? As much as I need. Whoa! That's very accommodating of you. Man, thank you. Thank you. Oh, I just feel a lot lighter now. Great, don't have those limitations. But I will not keep you too long. There have been two primary struggles I've had at Fuller academically, which I'd like to illustrate for you. One is completing final papers. The other has been learning biblical languages, which might be difficult for many of us, whether or not you have ADHD. So, it's been difficult to complete final papers as someone with ADHD. For my very first quarter, it has been very difficult to finish final papers with ADHD. I remember vividly getting oriented to Fuller and the library, which is amazing, I love it. And I remember, and this is a common occurrence that has happened throughout my time here, is I go into the library, my first quarter, and I choose a topic that I'm interested in, because that'll probably make it easier to write about. But I find one book, I look in the bibliography, ooh, I find another, and another, and another, and another. But not only on the topic at hand, but on many different topics. Things that I see connections with, and I can see very eclectically, and I see connections. And yet, the paper itself is asking to argue one thing, and to prove it systematically. Sorry, that's not how my brain works. But I've learned over time to cope with that. But I'm highlighting a difficulty with the way that I'm expected to communicate what I know. And so from the very first quarter, I asked for an incomplete. Because as I'm trying to maintain the weekly stability of just getting my homework done, which is a challenge in and of itself of managing everything in my life, on top of that, there's this big looming project in the future. And a problem with ADHD is the integration of past, present, and future, where I might be light years down the road or way in the past, in the present moment. And it can be difficult to sequence, especially when I'm researching and I'm, again, way deep, 6 feet under or in the future with literally like a dissertation worth of research. And I'm just trying to write a 15-page paper with 10, 15 sources. And I've looked at maybe 50. So my limitation of only, in a sense, only requiring 15 sources has also been limiting to me as well. Well, I'd love to cite the 50. And honestly, for one of my papers in my church planting class, I literally wrote over 60 pages and spent hours and hours and hours writing. But final, well, logically argued paper, I had maybe 9 pages of the 15 that were required. Did I not, in a sense, learn a lot? Did I not reflect a lot? Did I not, if you would have read it all, I went way beyond even what was expected. And yet I get a C- on the exam, or on the paper. That has been a common occurrence of dealing with the problem of a final paper, this big project that's looming because of the problems of sequencing, organizing information. And so to fast forward to a more success story, I guess. It's kind of bittersweet. I still had to ask for an incomplete this past quarter, 4 years into my time here at Fuller. And not only that, I had some difficulties even in the requesting of an incomplete, because dealing with the registrar, anything that is turned in after Friday at like 5 p.m. on finals week, you have to ask for an incomplete. And given the nature of my disability, the often occurrence of needing to request for extra time, which I'm given accommodation for extra time. But during the quarter, that's one thing. At the end of the quarter, that's another, I've found at Fuller. So at the end of the quarter, I need to, even though I'm guaranteed extra accommodation through Access Services, and even I discovered after about 20 emails back and forth with the registrar at length, having to advocate for myself and my situation, and having to justify that outside of my disability, I had other extenuating circumstances, these acute things that would come up that made it more difficult for me to complete the assignment. Well, there were many personal things that happened, which I will not disclose. I've learned there's sometimes you disclose things, sometimes you don't. So I will not get into why the certain extenuating circumstances outside of the normal ones of my cognitive disabilities. But I was forced to prove that outside of my chronic situation, that there were things that legitimized my request of an incomplete at the end of the quarter, or else my paper will not be graded. Which final papers are worth a lot, right? Do I have a high likelihood of passing if my final paper can't get graded? And the anxiety that produces when I'm trying to finish a final paper and I'm sending 20 emails back and forth to the registrar, just trying to get my legitimized, already in my Access Services document to get extra time. So I got the incomplete request, but even with my professor, he was very busy. He has his own life, and it was past the end of the quarter, which brings up other challenges. And so it took a while for him to get back to me, which again was anxiety producing because there's a lot riding on me finishing this class. It was my last Hebrew kind of class, an exegetical paper dealing with Hebrew. By the way, I failed Hebrew twice. Both the intensive the first time around with one professor, as well as the regular sequence. But then I passed the intensive my second time around taking it. Thank the Lord, I had two of my best friends in that class. They loved me so much as to meet with me on a regular basis, to learn and to study. And I've had to advocate for that as well. Many of our classes, very individualized, where our success really is dependent on ourselves. And when I get a chance to lead devotions in a class, like my Greek intensive class that I took in the fall, which I also didn't pass, 4% away from passing. Gosh. And I thought I could do it that quarter, so I didn't register with Access Services. And then at the end of the quarter, I can't really ask for accommodation. Another problem. 4% away. So because of not passing Greek intensive in the fall, well, the sequence of taking the Greek classes based on the old MDiv system, well, now I gotta switch to the new MDiv. So there's more classes I need to take, and because those classes are also in a sequence, I need to add on another year. That's thousands of more dollars. When I graduate, it'll be my 5th year. It's a 3-year full-time program. That causes some stress in a marriage. A little. And by the way, in undergrad, overall, 3.5 in my major classes, sociology, religious studies, not the hard sciences, 3.7s, 3.8s. I'm not stupid. But being at Fuller, I feel like it. Every quarter. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Justin. My name is Dan Beltman, and I'm also a student here at Fuller. And as you probably know, I do have a disability as well. I have cochlear implants. I lost my hearing when I was age 4, and I lost all of the hearing in my left ear and only had 25% in my right ear. And so I wore a hearing aid in one ear and could barely hear very well with that. But I had a twin brother, thankfully, who is my best friend and translated everything for me. Yeah, he's been my buddy. And so that's basically how I got through regular school system, high school, and most of college. My final year of college, I got my first cochlear implant, and then in graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh, I got my second cochlear implant. My hearing now is at about 94% comprehension, which is an amazing improvement, and I'm really grateful and thankful for that. But at the same time, it's not perfect. Even here at Fuller, it's been difficult, not only just hearing and understanding professors, but also being able to engage and participate in conversation and discussion with the other students, because they're either sitting behind me, which I can't see their lips, I can't lip read. And so that has been difficult as well. Thankfully, the Access Services has been a great resource for me. Even prior to coming Fuller, even undergrad and previous graduate program, I've had some sort of accommodations in terms of captionists or sign language interpreters. Here at Fuller, I do have captionists, and some of you may have a class with me. You'll see people sitting next to me. They're basically transcribing everything for me, which is a great asset for me, and it empowers me and enables me to actually participate in conversation that happened in the class, as well as ensures that I actually hear and understand what the professor is saying. As we have seen through the stories here, as well as my own, people with disabilities at Fuller face many obstacles in pursuit of learning. Our discussion today and the stories we just heard is not the end, however. Rather, we have come together and shared our stories because we have a vision of something better for Fuller and for our own lives and for the church. As we all know, the world today is not what it should be. We all have this deep inner sense that something is not right. Further, as Christians, our hope is for a better future, for the kingdom of God breaking in here and now. For people with disabilities, both physical, seen and unseen, and of social barriers magnify the sense of something being wrong. The stories today have demonstrated that. So how should we respond as a community here at Fuller Theological Seminary? What does this better future look like, and how do we get there? For one thing, this better future is not solely about inclusion, although it certainly does mean that. As Bethany mentioned earlier, everyone is made in the image of God, including people with disabilities, and therefore everyone has a calling and a vocation. Inclusion recognizes this and invites people with disabilities in, but it does not go far enough. In other words, instead, we need to not only recognize these calling and vocations among people with disabilities, but also to empower and encourage these individuals' pursuit of their calling and vocation. In other words, people with disability need to be fully participate in what they are doing. Barriers to disability not only exacerbate the challenges of disability, but also limit the individual's ability to live out their calling and vocation that God has given them. These barriers also limit their ability to fully participate in the ministry and the life of the church. Thus, we don't remove these barriers just to welcome people with disabilities, but we do so in order that they might fully participate in living out their calling and vocation, so they too might be God's witnesses to the ends of the earth. Several months ago, while attending a church event, a man approached me and asked me about my cochlear implants. I always welcome these sorts of questions, so afterwards, if you want to ask me about how they work, I'll be more than willing to. But after explaining what they were and how they worked, he asked me if I had ever gone to healing houses here in LA. My response was no, I hadn't. He insisted I should go in order that I might be healed of my hearing loss. That experience was troubling for me. While good intentioned, this man had presumed that a better future was one in which there was no hearing loss. Further, he assumed that I would be more effective in my ministry if my hearing was perfect. In other words, he presented a picture of a future in which I had no role in shaping. This story demonstrates that a better future is not only about people with disabilities. It is also about a future in which non-disabled people live and also live and participate. At Fuller Theological Seminary, we want to equip those who are training for ministry, whether they are disabled or non-disabled, whether they're training for be a pastor, a counselor, or for cross-cultural ministry. We want to prepare them for encountering people with disabilities. As leaders in our field, we will encounter people with disabilities. My father's ministry as a pastor included ministering to people with disabilities. My own work overseas in Ethiopia and Malawi, Africa, I too have encountered people with disabilities. But we may neglect this part of our ministry if we have not trained our eyes to see disabilities. More significantly, our ministry will be lacking if we are not training ourselves to engage with disabilities theologically. In light of this, a vision of a better future involves training and equipping students at Fuller for such encounters. This might mean developing Fuller curriculum, as Dr. Downs mentioned, that consider disabilities in the church and society. It might also mean providing opportunities and even encouraging students to write papers on disabilities in certain contexts or relating to certain church doctrines. There are many ways for Fuller to engage this topic. This vision is certainly practical, but most importantly, it is theological. Again, this vision is not solely aimed at inclusion. As Bethany mentioned, it is about Fuller Theological Seminary living out its mission to serve God in light of the realities of disabilities. In other words, it is about faculty, staff, and students living out God's command to love their neighbor by empowering and encouraging people with disabilities to live out the calling and vocation that God has placed on their lives. We strive for this vision not because people with disability urge us to. We strive for this vision because it is part of our discipleship as followers of Christ. Personally, I have a vision for Fuller Theological Seminary. It is a vision in which it continues to provide captionists and sign language interpreters for people who are deaf. But I envision something more than that. My vision for Fuller also addresses the social aspects of hearing loss as well. I envision Fuller to be a place where the fear of approaching me because of my hearing loss is removed. It means there is a constant readiness and willingness to repeat what is said. It is a place where patience is a key virtue in the context of making sure people with hearing loss understand. Each of us here on the panel today has a vision for Fuller as well. And we want to share that at the beginning of our conversation together about what Fuller might look like as a more inclusive, more welcoming place, place that empowers people with disabilities to fully participate in the life of Fuller. I believe this event tonight is an opportunity and a way for us to participate, and I'm glad we're able to have that. So first, we're just going to share our own vision, what we have, and then we will open it up to all of you.
Now. Okay, great. So, yeah, some things based on my own experience, and not only my own, but also I've come to know others with ADHD at Fuller, and some that are registered with Access Services and some that aren't, and for various reasons. So one vision, or part of the vision I see is awareness of the Office of Access Services on campus, and I've already met with Carmen Valdez multiple times and had very fruitful discussions with her, and I think it's a discussion that needs to be broader. It's almost like having this kind of conversation that we're having now, but having it more regularly. I've been participated in the Able Theology meetings, and it's telling Carmen earlier this week that it's not just a student group on campus. I mean, we have faculty participation, not just as advisors, but as participants in the group meetings, and we have vice provost, and we have staff members and people with and without disabilities on campus. So it's a very, I think, unique kind of group on campus. It sounds more like it's like part student group, part committee, advocacy, just a lot of different things. And so I think there's a lot that the Able Theology student group can do as a student group, but there's also limitations of just being a student group. And so a vision I have as well, or part of the vision, is to see the Able Theology student group be more integrated into the life of Fuller from the top down and bottom up. And so to, as we're talking about, having these conversations be beyond just our own kind of community, and don't we just talk about disabilities amongst people that are interested in that topic, but having it be something our professors might share about as a possible topic for papers even, and to even get people thinking about disabilities across the campus in various ways. And one more vision, part of the vision I'll pass over to Esther, would be training and equipping for faculty and staff, as well as for students, and offering, and again, talked about this with Carmen before, about TA issues and professor issues, registrar issues, where there can be better communication and better understanding of what current policies are and what is possible, as well as what isn't and what might need to change. And so making sure TAs at least they know where to go themselves to get the resources. If the student with disabilities comes to them, it's like, oh, at least that was part of my training packet or so, and I'll refer to that. I know where to go to do that, rather than the student having to educate them.
My vision for Fuller is that it becomes a place where students with disabilities are welcome and belong. A place where students with disabilities thrive instead of having a high dropout rate. And a place where students with disabilities can get their needs met without needing to navigate the black hole and invisible authorities.
Bethany, do you want to share?
So my vision is partly related to, as part of my work on my dissertation, I did interviews with various pastors in the area about how they kind of welcomed people with disabilities into their congregations. And I would say overall, the ways that pastors talk about it is very practical and not very theological. So they have a lot of thoughts about how high the screen should be and where the ramp should go, and it's very practical kinds of conversations. But it's very clear that pastors haven't been trained on how to think about disability theologically. And why do we care about building ramps? Is it just because this person here needs it? That's not a bad reason. But it's also like, are there other things that have to do with our discipleship to Jesus that's actually a part of our faithfulness and not just issues of practicality? So my vision for Fuller would really be a place where I think it would be great if there were specific courses devoted to like disability and the congregation, where people could kind of get a really thorough understanding of issues of disability and what happens in ministry and how to think about that theologically and biblically and those kinds of things. But even more than that it would be something that touches every academic course, that because if people are going into the world to do ministry in churches, tons of people have disabilities, invisible and visible disabilities. And if we haven't been trained on how to think about those disabilities biblically and theologically, then it ends up always being kind of logistical conversations. And those are just not the most fruitful for our lives of faith. So that's my vision.
Thank you. So here's what I wanted to gently, respectfully suggest right now, literally suggest to us right now, is that we come down closer as a symbolic gesture of closing the gap and the distance between us. If you would be so kind and move down, that's one request. The other one is not only for it to be a symbolic gesture, but to make the eye contact and throughout our time here to make more physical contact. The other thing, if it's okay with you,
if you're able.
The reason why I'm here, just very quickly, is in the 1930s and 40s, my uncle had very severe cerebral palsy, and it was before they even had a diagnosis for cerebral palsy. And so when we would walk around in public, there was a great amount, I'm not from the 1930s and 40s, but my parents would encounter a lot of stigma and shame and embarrassment and frustration, because in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, there weren't any services or advocacy groups. So it's very personal to me. And again, I thank you for courage and being so eloquent.
Thank you for sharing. I have a question. My friends with disabilities have various responses. Some are sick to death of people asking them, about disability. Others, as you said, you'd be glad to talk about the implants. Dr. Martinez mentioned too that when there's an approach to a person with a disability, sometimes there is that pent-up anger. So I know there's no monolithic way to, because we're all individuals, to approach the conversation. And I've heard you say it should be encouraging encounters and empowering both directions with persons with disabilities and persons who have fewer disabilities or different disabilities. So I don't know if you could comment on how you might prefer someone to even begin a conversation.
That's a topic of a lot of conversation very recently, because for me, I was diagnosed just over 2 years ago, and it's something that, again, isn't necessarily a physical reality for me. And so, again, you might look at me and not see a disability. So it's like, so people, as I've been sharing about it and advocating for myself and becoming more self-aware and sharing about it online and things like that, now other people are responding and trying to figure out how do I talk about this? Do I just share scriptures? Do I say? Some people respond with minimizing and saying that it's not a real thing. That's not very helpful, by the way. But what I'm trying to communicate to people is to, in various ways, I'm just learning how to do it myself, and I'm in the process and learning how to just communicate publicly and in conversation, and learning what is helpful. And some things I've learned is, so far, one thing I've learned is inviting people to journey with me and to come alongside. And what that says is you're allowing me to have this disability and to identify and saying, okay, whether or not I agree with it or have different opinions is, for you, that's your situation, and I want to learn. And a posture of humility, saying that how do I, even asking that question, how do I talk to you about this, and I have anxiety over this. That is actually very helpful for me. I can work with that. And so that's my encouragement, if you see me on campus or whatnot, and I can just speak for myself, but even just asking that question and learning to wrestle with that yourself and the anxiety it produces in you, and being honest with yourself on where you're coming from and why you might be uncomfortable talking about disabilities in general.
I have every person with a disability.
I can't speak for everyone with a disability,
But I'm pretty open about disability.
but I'm really open about talking about disability issues.
I have a lot of friends with disabilities too.
I have a lot of friends with disabilities too. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any friend who won't talk about their disability. A few of my friends and I even made a documentary about college life with disabilities. I think everybody is different. So if you come from a respectful place, I think that would be appreciated.
Everyone is different, and so everyone on their journey with their own disability is at a different point. Myself, I'm 29 years old. I've grown up and experienced a disability, and along the journey I've come to, honestly at first I rejected it and said, no, this is wrong, I hate it that I have hearing loss. But then I did reach a point eventually when I said, this is part of who I am, and that's okay. Recognizing who I am as a child of God in light of my disability. But it's not everyone is there. And so I think when approaching people with disabilities and starting that conversation, we have to show humility, not just to be humble, but also in order that we learn to understand where they're at. And then once learning that, understanding that, and then going from there. And it is a difficult process, and I think people with disabilities recognize that. And like Dr. Martinez said earlier, it's not just about people with disabilities or people without disabilities trying to offer help and dictate it, and showing grace that way. But it's also the reverse too. We as the people with disabilities also need to show grace, and that's something we're all learning, and how we learn to show grace, how we show love to our neighbors. So I think just keeping that in mind, I think is really helpful.
So my name is Rosala. Hi, Alicia. My name is Rosala, and I've been here. This is my 4th year at Fuller. So I've been here a while, and it's really exciting to me to see this topic even talked about. So this is really, amazing. And I do want to share a little bit. I think as you guys were talking, and I think the things that come up for me, it's a much broader issue. I think we have to recognize that there's a sociological. So where we are in seminary is a reflection of maybe much broader of models and things like that. So one of the things that I think is really important, and I forgot your name, Dr.
Bethany.
You're doing it, doctor.
But how do you see the doctor?
Bethany. My name is Bethany. You need to say doctor.
I really, really appreciate what you said about the theology of it, because I came to Fuller, and I'm a disabilities advocate. I'm the director of disability services at another institution, so I've been around this field for a long, long time. But when I came to Fuller, I did not put on that hat. So I've been very much in the background. I don't do much advocacy other than if I can get into a building or, things like that. But other than that, I haven't really done much. However, lately, I did notice some things in class. For instance, one of them was culture. As MDivs and MET students, sometimes we have to take a required culture class. And I noticed right off the bat that everything was talked about except for disability. So I didn't make a big deal about it in class, but I did write a little bit of feedback to the professor. And so as I've been here, this is my 4th year now, I'm becoming more, vocal about looking at these issues theologically and presenting that in class, because I realize that's definitely not being talked about. So I think if we start there, it will, definitely we'll begin to question some of our structures of thinking that do come from sociological. It's a much bigger issue, and I think it will help us deconstruct why we view certain things the way we do. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I think I was a special education teacher for a number of years and have done other kinds of work like that. And the reality is churches do end up using, because we're not having the conversation here in our theology classes and in our Bible classes, when you're in a church, the only language you have to go back to is the language in the public sphere, like public school language, federal, the ADA. That's the language you have to draw from, because we're not talking about it as, what do followers of Jesus think about disability? All of that, because we're not having that conversation. That's the only choice. And so I just thank you for bringing that up as a student. And in my experience, I didn't go here for my MDiv, but unless I brought it up, it wasn't getting talked about. And here, it's been similar. I've had other students bring it up, I've brought it up, but, and so it would be great if that could keep happening, but then also have it happening, from the other side too, that it would be kind of acknowledged multi-directionally as an important conversation.
I hear so many parallels with race as far as discrimination and civil rights. And yeah, if you turn a lot of the language around and you made it a conversation about race, it makes so much sense. So my question for you guys, how do you process these things emotionally? Because that has to be hard. Even to talk about race, it's hard for me, and sometimes I get so angry and other times I get so hurt. So how do you guys process this emotionally? Because from what I'm hearing, and this is just from my lens, maybe it's just my bias, but this is like Jim Crow in a lot of ways, So how do you process this emotionally, spiritually?
My sister sometimes makes a parallel. Then I'm like an African American student. Before integration. It's definitely been hard here. Even though I've been doing well academically. I'm continuously thinking about dropping out. I hope our dialogue will promote a better environment.
I also wanted to answer your question about how do we cope with it. For me, like I said earlier, it's been a lifelong journey, and I think sometimes easy for me sometimes to make it sound good, that it's all in the past, but there is pain there, and it is difficult. And even for me personally, just hearing stories from Esther and Justin and other people at Fuller, that is painful for me to hear too. And so there is that pain, and I think it is very, very important for all of us to recognize that pain. And at the same time, like I said earlier, everyone is at a different point. And so I think we just have to respect that. But in the process, we encourage people to continue along in the journey rather than saying that's where you are and keeping them there. We try to create an environment in which they can move forward. So that they can not only just deal with that pain and address it, but also that they can learn and heal from it as well. Personally, I think for me, it has been my faith that has been central to it. Recognizing that I am a child of God. My wounds from my hearing loss and my experience is not healed of my own doing. Something that I just magically one day woke up and said, "Oh, okay, that's fine. I don't have to deal with that anymore. It's all been by God's grace." And it is by through Christ. Christ now bears the scars in his hands and his side and his feet. And likewise, I think I bear scars like that too. But those wounds too, I think personally they're healed, but they're there. But for everyone, it is a different experience.
Find me on Facebook. But it's a very deep process, and just to who am I, who is God, and what's my mission and purpose in the world? Those have been the three, since I've been diagnosed, those have been the three huge questions that I've had to reinterpret based on a medical diagnosis, which has been helpful, but also harmful.
I just wanted to make a comment. My name is Kevin. It's my third quarter year, so I'm a newer student. I guess I'd like to envision just resources to help build the community. I know that would help students not only transition in class, because I know I work with the Access Group, the office, and they've been great to help me transition in class, but outside of the classroom, what is life like outside the classroom for those who are limited or disabled or chronic illness? Helping students transition, finding their place in this community, the churches around here, getting them situated. I know housing has student housing coordinators, but maybe a low-hanging fruit might possibly be to have coordinators that are dedicated to helping address the needs of the different needs that we have. And I just wanted to say that in doing this, I think would help me understand and utilize all of what Fuller is offering students who are disabled, but also help me find a place where I can give back, because I feel lost in terms of what is my place and what can I do for this community, what do I have to offer.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Melissa Beth. I'm a third-year psych student here, so I've been here a while. But coming to Fuller as a person with a physical disability but that didn't need to go through the access services is kind of a unique experience, because that's really the only, it's kind of sad, it's really the only communal connection you have to people with disabilities or to the discussion about disabilities. Because I didn't even know this group existed for the 3 years I've been here.
It just started this year.
It just started, and that's what I kind of thought, but I didn't want to say that if it wasn't true.
Sure.
But I think part of my vision is something that very much addresses accessibility, because even the elevator in this building has not worked for the past week, and all it has is a sign that we're sorry for the inconvenience. That gets to me. But something that goes much more beyond the accessibility issues and addresses the deep pain that comes with it, as well as the exclusions, and speaking of the race, the microaggressions that happen often that are unspoken, and just the concerns and thoughts of you're not really quite sure how you're being perceived by other people here. And yeah, that goes beyond just we need ramps and we need these things, which are very, very important. I don't want to undermine those, but we don't want to stop there.
I really loved, Bethany, your reading of the scripture. I know you said that it'd be nice to have classes in the future, but is there any professor who is talking or a Bible study that you're aware of or curriculum online? Because I loved having new eyes to see that scripture, so I would love to grow theologically that way. I'm a theology student. So if you could recommend any class, professor, curriculum, or your own Bible study if you're leading, because I would love those eyes to see scripture that way.
But I don't know anyone at Fuller. I know Erin Defoe Hunter is another ethicist, and she teaches like a bioethics class that talks about disability issues. But I don't know anybody who's really doing like disability readings of scripture or anything like that. There are a lot of books I can recommend to you. We can talk afterward.
Did you post it on your Facebook page?
Sure, I'll post them on the Able Theology. We have a Facebook page. We meet once a month. I don't know if we're having a May meeting. We'll post that on our Facebook page. So yeah, just like us on Facebook. We'll need, I'm graduated now, and Esther and I will be able to be the student representatives next year. So we'll need a total of 3, and I know we have some interest, but if you're interested in being a student representative for the upcoming year, also come and talk to us afterward. So.
If you don't, it's just going to be me. So please don't leave me alone.
Thank you all for everything.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I think this is a great start to the dialogue. And hopefully we can keep the dialogue going.
Yep, thank you.
So thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate it.
At the
are cookies and some Oreos.